Okay, I mentioned a couple of times ago that what you find in this area is there's not a lot of love for your neighbor. There's a tremendous amount of conflict within countries, between countries, in Southeast Asia, and I sort of alluded to that before, but let's sort of finish that chunk off now. Um, these areas become colonized. We'll see this again, especially when you hit Africa, the African continent, and actually also Latin America. But what you get is your colonial governments come in, and the British take over a spot and they draw a line again, like last time. They decide one area is going to be Malaysia, and they decide another is going to be Singapore. They're doing this in London, or they're doing it in Rotterdam or someplace like that, and so guys are drawing these lines on these maps and basically saying this is ours and this is yours, and that's fine for the Europeans. They other than making money out of this and sort of figuring out where they are, they don't really have a lot of skin in the game. And because you didn't have traditional political entities that controlled large areas in here, you don't have an equivalent to large, like the Mauryan Empire in India or something like that. So you didn't have any internal history of regional control. And so what happens is post World War II, which is pretty much when all this happens and these places become independent, what you get is people get their independence because they can't stand being under the Europeans. And if you think about it, this is when you look at independence occurs in two ways. You can either have independence because you want something. So you can argue to a certain extent one of the reasons the United States sort of succeeded after its independence movement from England was the fact that it wanted, better representation, more democratic procedures, et cetera, et cetera. And it didn't think it was getting that of the Brits. So they wanted something. Okay, so there's a goal, there's a visible goal, and to a certain extent, a large part of the population shares in the goal that has an outcome. Now, the other way you can do this is true of colonization in a lot of areas, Latin America, Africa, and here in Southeast Asia, is that you want to get rid of something. So what you want is you want the British out, or you want the French out if you're French Indochina, you want the Dutch out if it's Indonesia. So you want to get rid of something, and that's your goal. But if you think about it, if it's Indonesia, for example, you've achieved that. So, okay, it's now Indonesia, you've got rid of the Dutch, and now you're independent. The problem you've got is that was a negative outcome in the sense that you want to get rid of something, but your goal didn't have a positive result. Your goal was, okay, they're not here anymore. I want to put that in an analogy. For example, you say, let's say I'm going to have a cracker. So a positive outcome would be, I want to be able to eat the cracker I want to eat. The negative would be, I don't want you to tell me what I can eat, which, both have outcomes. One I get a cracker, and the other one I get to choose what I'm going to eat. But if you think about the second, it really doesn't give you any direction about what you're going to have for lunch. It just says you're not going to tell me what to have for lunch. And this is the problem you get into in large parts of the world. And I would argue to a certain extent, even what's now usually called Eastern Europe, is the regional boundaries were set up by folks from outside the region. They do not relate to ethnic attitudes, linguistic, or in many cases, even religion, especially in Southeast Asia. So what you've got is because a colonial guy drew a line on a map, it's that area on the left side of the map is still mine, and the right side of the map is still yours. But all we could agree on, is we didn't want the guys telling us what to do. But if you think about it, now that the new days come, we're now Indonesia. And okay, the Dutch are gone. Everyone's partied for a day or two. We're now independent. Now we're looking at each other like, oh, now what do we do? Now the problem is because we didn't build a consensus on that. We didn't have a positive consensus. When we become independent, this is what we want with a list of stuff. Then what you get into is things pretty much disintegrate really quickly because you end up with whoever's the most powerful or whatever factions are floating around, the one that has the most oomph in one way, shape, or form is going to end up in charge. But a lot of the other folks in that area, especially if like here, it's really diverse, aren't going to feel that their interests are taken into account with this new system. In fact, in a lot of this area, as with Africa and a lot of Latin America, is you sort of get an attitude that once you've got rid of, say, the Spanish or whoever it is, that then what you get is the new guys in charge, basically you start to see them the same way. To a certain extent, they might be from your island, but you still see them as the new colonial masters because they don't reflect you. And your attitude is, we had no say in this. You had a say in getting rid of the Dutch or whoever, but you had no say in what you've turned into. And so what you get is this very frequently escalates. It doesn't eventually mellow out. In many cases, it actually gets worse and worse and worse. And the end result is Phnom Penh finally it blows up in your face. That would be Myanmar right now. So these post-colonial governments pretty much were based on negatives. We want to get rid of, whoever the colonial power is. And the problem is once you've done that, you don't really have a positive thing that you've agreed on. You can come up with a positive thing afterwards. But, since everyone else in the region didn't buy into it, to a certain extent, you have no guarantee they're going to buy into it now. In fact, since they're now independent, they're probably more tempted to do their own thing and they're less likely to buy into it. So the boundaries that you see in Southeast Asia, as in Africa and Latin America, are much more reflective of the colonial period. They've become countries, Indonesia, the Philippines, etc., but they're not countries who you would say are nation states, in the sense that they share a, collective, social, cultural consciousness of who they are. They might disagree about parts of it, say the French, for example, but it's a pretty good idea that the border of the country of France is pretty close to the people that see themselves as French. That's not true in Southeast Asia. Ethnic Vietnamese, for example, they're the largest group and they run Vietnam. It's their country. But you've still got, I think, at least 60 or 70 entirely different populations, especially in the mountain regions like the Hmong and such like that, who, just as a note, a lot of them ended up here as refugees after the Vietnam War. There are now a lot of Mountain Waianae. So you've got a lot of different groups that, never liked the Vietnamese, never got along with the Vietnamese. Under the French, they had to put up with the Vietnamese. But once you get rid of the French and Vietnam becomes a country, these guys are sort of going like, well, we want our own state. And the Vietnamese are going like, that ain't happening. So what you had is a lot of this region was defined by their shared enemies, the people they didn't like, the people they wanted to get rid of. And once you've got rid of the Europeans and much of this region, I mentioned already, get rid of the Chinese, who are another group you dislike, then you start looking within your own borders for the groups who aren't like you, and you start going after them. And that's what you're seeing in Myanmar right now. The conflict in Myanmar is somewhere between a civil war and an ethnic cleansing. And what it is the majority Burmese are basically deciding they don't want any minority groups in their country. And the minority groups, are sort of like, well, we didn't get a say on this, so off you go. Very, very typical for this region. And it's very hard to figure out how you would ever resolve that. Because if you're the group in charge, you don't see any particular need to share your power or authority with groups who you don't consider as good as you. If you're the groups that aren't involved in it, then you don't feel any reason why you should obey the guys in charge. This would be the Southern Islands of Mindanao and the Moro independence movements versus the Philippine central government, which is largely Tagalog. Two entirely different groups, two entirely different religions. The only thing they have in common is they were part of the Spanish collection called the Philippines. And when the Americans took it over, they kept the same borders. So when the Philippines became independent, that was the country. But that doesn't mean the people in it share a sense of, sort of nation state identity. So this is the problem you see here. It's not unique to this region, but it's the first time we've seen it where it's pretty much collectively found throughout the region. In some ways, you could argue, ironically, that maybe Singapore is the strongest of these, since that's largely a migratory population and a huge proportion are, I think, Chinese. That might maybe that's the most stable, which is one reason why it probably is stable compared to its neighbors. This is also an area because it was always on the margins or on the fringe, and because you didn't have a lot of centralized control. And of course, when independence comes, and you've got even, in some ways, even more decentralized control. This area is famous for resource destruction. The most famous would be the just totally uncontrolled logging in places like Indonesia, Malaysia, Cambodia. This is an area that rather surreally is famous for things like dynamite fishing, especially in the Philippines, where you take ex-World War II munitions, for example, grenades and whatever, and you basically chuck them off a boat into the water so that you blow the fish up so you don't have to go and fish for them. In the process, of course, you not only kill all the fish, including the ones you don't want, but you also destroy the reef, etc. You would think for a fisherman, it's incredibly short-sighted to basically destroy your livelihood. But it's very typical in this region, where people's desire to have it now just sort of short circuits our idea of down the road, like a year from now, 5 years, around 10 years. So what you find is the very same guys that are blowing up the reef and a couple of years later will complain there's no fish anymore. It's like, well, dude, what do you expect? Or they'll log out an area, and then all the locals who are involved in the logging operation will be saying like, well, now there's no trees. And it's like, well, yeah, so this is an area where we see a huge amount of environmental damage. And because the countries are so sort of decentralized, in the sense that the ethnic group that runs the country, a lot of the stuff is happening in other parts of the country that they don't really see as quote being theirs, unquote. So they don't really care what happens out there. It's sort of like an empty lot. So the amount of environmental damage in this region is sort of mind-blowing, and it's pretty distressing when you realize that there's not a lot of logic behind it. It just sort of is what it is. One thing you do find in this region that's very, very key to the way things work is the idea of remittance economies. This is an area of the world, but by the 1930s, 40s, you already had a concept of basically exporting people. So instead of, like making shoes or something like that, what you do is you actually export your population. Your population goes somewhere else in the world and sends money home. Now, of course, this has existed for ages. It's a large part of the population here arrived in Hawaii. But what happens, especially post-World War II, is your banking industry changes. Now, you still see little bits of the older system. This is why if you're in some areas of the Pacific or even here in Hawaii, it's actually pretty easy to find a Western Union office. Because Western Union used to be the one service that you could send money pretty much to anyone anywhere in the world. You could send them basically a Western Union check. They could take it to a Western Union outlet wherever they lived and cash it. I used to see these all over Hong Kong, for example, because people would use these to send money to relatives in China. So that was the old system. With modern digitized banking, which is, if you're familiar with what's going on this week, is what the Russians just got shut out of with a couple of days ago by the Europeans. Basically, all the money transfers occur, of course, digitally. The same way that you have you access your accounts generally digitally. You almost never go to a bank per se. And so what happens in that context is incredibly easy as long as the other guy's hooked up to the internet and their bank is part of the banking system. It's incredibly easy to move money around globally nowadays. And that's been true for the last 40 or 50 years. When that starts to become common, when it's very easy for me to send money to my relatives in northern Luzon or something like that in the Philippines, and I don't have to worry about where the money's going to get there. Then what happens is the idea of me going somewhere to work, no matter where in the world it is, and sending money back home becomes a real logical career move, or labor choice, especially if there's not a lot of jobs at home or the jobs don't pay very well. Now, Hong Kong is one of the most famous of these because if you go anywhere in Hong Kong, you see tons of Filipinos who work in the Hong Kong service sector, specifically for even like middle-class Filipinos or middle-class Hong Kongers will have a Filipino maid or servant or nanny. If they've got a car, they generally don't do the driving, it'll Filipino driver. And that's simply because they can get labor so cheap. And it's sort of a status thing in Hong Kong. If you're upper middle class or anything like that, you have to have servants. It's just sort of the de rigueur logic of it. And the Filipinos are they're pretty much the functional unit that happens. And it works to a large part because the Filipinos speak English. They're under American influence for about 60 years. And of course, in Hong Kong, under British control till 40 years ago, they too speak English. So the irony is the Filipinos don't know Cantonese and the Hong Kongers don't know any Tagalog or the Commonwealth or whatever, but the groups have, again, a lingua franca. They share this common language of English, and therefore the Filipinos working in Hong Kong send money back to the family in the Philippines, and maybe go back and visit them once or twice a year or whatever. And so what you've done is in the Philippines, as especially also Indonesia, is this labor export, which you call a remittance economy, sending money back home, has actually become the major economic drive for both these countries. A large part in the Philippines, somewhere between 20-25% of the entire economy is based on people sending money back home to the relatives. As we'll see when we get into the Pacific, this is of course the norm here for much of the Pacific, but it's the first place we've seen it. The Philippines and Indonesia, between the two of them, have an enormous percentage of population working other places. If you remember our videos, the Dubai one, I think it was the mall one. They mentioned that labor that they've got in Dubai and Saudi Arabia, etc. That's largely Indonesian labor, and again because they all speak Arabic. Most of the Indonesians that are in these global labor markets are Muslim, and because one of the unifying factors of Muslim is you have to learn how to at least in some ways understand and speak Arabic because that's their version of the way God speaks. So if you're Muslim in Saudi Arabia, you can hire Indonesians whom you have nothing else in common with, because again, this idea of sort of a shared language. So what you find in this part of the world is exporting your population actually is one of the major strategies these countries do to, stay financially solvent. They're not competitive in labor markets in terms of production or something like that. And in much of this region, their educational level isn't high enough for them to be competitive in a real sort of, production-based market like you'd see in China. And so, what they do is they export people, and that's your remittance economies. We'll see them again, but this is the first region where they actually become central. As we pointed out, the Philippines would pretty much, the economic system would collapse if something happened to these remittance economies. The country depends on it. The government builds the remittance system into their idea of how much money they're going to make every week and every year. So it's sort of an interesting process.